The microphone hit the studio floor with a metallic crash that echoed through the late night with Canon O'Brien set. For the first time in 30 years of television, Canon O'Brien was speechless. The audience of 200 people sat frozen, unsure whether they had just witnessed television history or something far more profound. The cameras kept rolling, but everyone in that studio understood they were no longer watching entertainment. They were witnessing a man's soul being laid bare under the bright lights of late-night television. It started as an ordinary Tuesday evening taping in Burbank. The familiar blue and gold late night with Canon O'Brien logo glowed behind the host's desk, casting warm shadows across the polished studio floor. Canon sat in his signature navy suit, red hair perfectly styled, that mischievous grin playing at the corners of his mouth as he worked through his opening monologue. The audience was responsive, laughing at all the right moments, energy building toward the guest segment. Tonight's guest was supposed to be routine. Tony Rodriguez, 45, a recently retired corrections officer from San Quentin State Prison. The booking had come through official channels. The California Department of Corrections wanted positive publicity about their rehabilitation programs. Tony was meant to discuss prison reform, maybe share some light-hearted stories about inmates turning their lives around. Standard late-night fare with a touch of social consciousness. But as Tony walked onto the stage during the commercial break, Canon noticed something in the man's eyes that the pre-interview hadn't captured. Tony Rodriguez was built like someone who had spent decades in environments where physical presence mattered. Broad shoulders, weathered hands, a face that had seen too much. But there was something else. A weight in his posture, a deliberate slowness in his movements that spoke of a man carrying invisible burdens. "Mr. Rodriguez," Canon said warmly as they shook hands during the break, "ready to tell America about the good work you've been doing?" Tony's grip was firm, but his eyes didn't meet Canon's directly. "I hope so, Mr. O'Brien. I really hope so." The cameras came back on. Canon delivered his guest introduction with professional enthusiasm. The audience applauded politely as Tony settled into the guest chair, his large frame making the furniture look smaller than usual. For the first few minutes, everything proceeded according to script. "So, Tony, 20 years as a corrections officer, that must give you some unique perspectives on human nature," Canon began, leaning forward with genuine interest. "Yes, sir, it does," Tony replied, his voice carrying a slight tremor that the studio microphones picked up clearly. "You see people at their worst, and sometimes at their best, too." Canon smiled, expecting this to lead into one of the positive rehabilitation stories they'd discussed. "Tell us about the best part of the job. What kept you going for 2 decades? That's when Tony Rodriguez looked directly into Canon's eyes for the first time, and Canon saw something that made his smile falter. Not fear, not nervousness, but shame so deep it seemed to emanate from the man's core. "Mr. O'Brien," Tony said quietly, "I need to tell you something that wasn't in that pre-interview." The studio audience sensed the shift in energy. Conversations in the back rows died down. Canon's producer, watching from the control booth, leaned forward. This wasn't the script. "Okay," Canon said carefully, his comedian's instincts telling him to redirect, but his human instincts telling him to listen. "What's on your mind?" Tony's hands gripped the arms of his chair. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession. "For 20 years, I was supposed to protect people, to serve justice, to help with rehabilitation." He paused, swallowing hard. "But for most of those 20 years, I was the problem." Canon's eyebrows raised slightly. The audience was completely silent now. Even the cameras seemed to zoom in unconsciously, drawn to the raw honesty unfolding. "What do you mean by that?" Canon asked gently. Tony looked down at his hands, then back up at Canon. "I was cruel, Mr. O'Brien. I was everything wrong with the system. I used my power to hurt people who couldn't fight back. I justified it by telling myself they deserved it, that they were animals, that they had forfeited their right to be treated like human beings. The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Cannon's usual quick wit had completely abandoned him. This wasn't comedy anymore. This wasn't even television anymore. This was a man confessing his sins to the world. I made men strip naked in the cold and hose them down for my own amusement, Tony continued, his voice growing stronger as the words poured out. I withheld medical care from inmates I didn't like. I planted contraband in cells to extend sentences. I looked the other way when my colleagues did worse things, much worse things. Cannon's face had gone pale. Behind Tony, the Late Night with Canon O'Brien logo continued to glow cheerfully, a stark contrast to the darkness being revealed in its light. Tony, Cannon said softly, why are you telling me this? Why here? Why now? Tony's eyes filled with tears. Because 6 months ago I met a man named Miguel Santos at a grocery store. He recognized me from the prison. And instead of running, instead of calling me names or wanting revenge, he thanked me. Thanked you? Cannon's voice was barely above a whisper. He said that watching me treat him like garbage every day for 3 years taught him what he never wanted to become, that my cruelty showed him the kind of person he was determined not to be when he got out. He said I accidentally gave him the greatest gift of his life, the clear knowledge of what evil looks like, so he could choose good. Tony wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. And then he told me he forgave me. This man whose life I made hell for 3 years forgave me, and I realized I've been carrying 20 years of shame, thinking I was beyond redemption. Canon O'Brien had hosted thousands of guests. He had navigated awkward moments, controversial topics, and unexpected revelations, but nothing had prepared him for this moment of complete, unguarded human vulnerability. Without consulting his producers, without thinking about ratings or network executives or the millions of people watching at home, Canon O'Brien stood up from behind his desk. The studio audience watched in stunned silence as Canon walked around to where Tony sat. For a moment, he just stood there, looking down at this man who had just confessed to decades of cruelty on national television. Then Canon O'Brien did something unprecedented in late-night television history. He knelt down beside Tony's chair. "Tony," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the studio, "look at me." Tony raised his eyes, tears streaming down his face. "The fact that you're here," Canon said, "the fact that you're saying these words, the fact that you feel this pain, that's not the voice of someone beyond redemption. That's the voice of someone who has found their humanity." Canon reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a white pocket square. Without ceremony, he handed it to Tony. "Miguel Santos was right to forgive you. But more importantly, you need to forgive yourself." The audience was crying now. Not the polite, emotional response of a television audience, but the genuine tears of people witnessing something sacred. In the control booth, producers had stopped worrying about commercial breaks and runtime. They were watching something that transcended television. Tony looked at the pocket square in his hands. How do I live with what I've done? How do I make amends for 20 years of being everything wrong with the world? Canon was still kneeling, completely abandoning every rule of television hosting, by doing exactly what you're doing right now, by telling the truth, by making sure your story helps other people choose differently. He stood up slowly and addressed the audience directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to understand what just happened here. This man could have stayed silent. He could have kept his secrets. He could have let the world think he was here to talk about prison reform as a hero. Instead, he chose to tell the truth about his failures. That takes more courage than any joke I've ever told." Canon turned back to Tony. "You want to make amends? Start by knowing that every person who hears your story tonight will think twice before they abuse whatever power they have. Every guard, every boss, every person in authority will remember Tony Rodriguez and maybe choose compassion instead of cruelty." But Canon wasn't finished. He walked back to his desk and opened a drawer that guests never saw. He pulled out something that caught the studio lights, a small silver compass, worn smooth from years of handling. "This belonged to my grandfather," Canon said, walking back to Tony. "He carried it through World War II. He gave it to me when I was struggling to find my way in comedy, told me it would always point me toward true north, toward what's right." He placed the compass in Tony's hands. "I want you to have this. Because you're not lost anymore, Tony. You found your way back to humanity. And that's the hardest journey any of us can make." Tony stared at the compass, his hands trembling. "I don't deserve this." "That's exactly why you do deserve it," Canon replied. "Because someone who thinks they don't deserve forgiveness is someone who understands the weight of their actions. That's the beginning of real change." The camera captured Tony's face as he held the compass, a mixture of gratitude, disbelief, and something that looked like hope beginning to bloom after years of darkness. Canon sat back down at his desk, but the show's format had been completely abandoned. "Tony, what are you going to do now?" Tony wiped his eyes again, his voice steadier now. "I'm going to spend however many years I have left trying to undo the damage I caused. I'm going to speak at police academies, correction officer training programs, anywhere they'll listen. I'm going to make sure that every person who might have power over someone else's life knows what it looks like when that power corrupts." "And Miguel Santos?" Canon asked. Tony smiled through his tears, the first genuine smile that had crossed his face all evening. "He's starting a nonprofit to help ex-convicts reintegrate into society. He asked me to help, said he could use someone who understands how the system fails people." The audience erupted in applause, but it wasn't the manufactured enthusiasm of late-night television. It was the sound of people recognizing genuine transformation, genuine hope. Canon looked directly into the camera. "I've been making people laugh for 30 years, and I hope I've brought some joy into the world. But tonight, Tony Rodriguez showed us something more important than laughter. He showed us what real courage looks like. He showed us that it's never too late to choose who you want to be." As the cameras continued to roll, Canon made one final unprecedented decision. "We're going to end tonight's show here," he announced, "because some moments are too important to follow with comedy. Some truths are too sacred to chase with punchlines." He stood up and shook Tony's hand one more time. "Thank you for your honesty. Thank you for your courage. And thank you for showing all of us that redemption is possible, even when we think we're beyond saving." The studio audience rose to their feet, not because they were cued to, but because they couldn't remain seated. They applauded not for entertainment, but for transformation. They had witnessed a man publicly reckon with his demons and emerge, not unscathed, but redeemed. As the credits rolled over the image of Canon and Tony shaking hands, viewers across the country sat in their living rooms, many wiping away tears, all of them thinking about their own choices, their own power, their own capacity for both cruelty and compassion. The episode became the most watched late-night show in television history. But more importantly, it sparked a national conversation about accountability, redemption, and the courage required to confront our worst selves. Tony Rodriguez kept his promise. He spent the following years speaking at correction facilities, police academies, and law enforcement conferences. His story became a powerful tool for change within the prison system. The compass Canon gave him never left his pocket. And Canon O'Brien learned something that night that changed how he approached every show afterward. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen not when you get the biggest laugh, but when you create the space for someone to tell their deepest truth. The microphone was picked up from the studio floor within minutes, but the impact of what happened when it fell, when entertainment stopped and humanity began, continues to resonate, reminding us all that it's never too late to choose redemption over shame, truth over silence, and courage over comfort.